I think we'll get started with segment number 2, which is going to be a deep dive into policy mapping and what maps are most appropriate for what part of your policy life cycle. Just a little bit of review. Policy maps show more than just the data itself. It shows an opportunity to intervene, meaning where populations are faring well versus where populations are not faring well, or could be showing progress toward a goal, or who's in compliance, who's not. It basically provides a little bit more of a specific focused view of the data itself that underlies the whole thing. So some examples from my work, the first one being what share of workers is age 65 and over, and therefore are going to be retiring in the next 5 to 10 years. Notice this map is not called labor force participation by age, by tract. It's really illuminating, hey, here's where there's going to be a workforce shortage soon. Another example is a 40-hour work week normal? And again, it's not, the title of the map is not average hours worked per week. That's a great name for the data table itself and possibly the layer. But here we've used symbology and this question format to really turn this map into showing a specific issue. So here we've chosen to use red to show above 40. We could have very easily done the reverse of that, but you might think, well, why did we pick 40? That's where you're considered full-time. That's often where you get health insurance, if you're lucky enough to get some kind of benefits like that. So there's a hard cutoff to that policy. So our map ought to have a hard cutoff to that color ramp as well. So an above and below type of color ramp like this really illuminates hours where a 40-hour work week is not normal. In this case, that Midwest corridor, they're actually on average working way more than 40 hours. So possibly a lot of overtime is expected. They're working maybe 2 jobs or self-employed, something like that. Like I mentioned earlier, we could have very easily flipped this in terms of the color ramp to show red as areas where they're working significantly below 40. And perhaps the story there is that they're not getting the number of hours that they would like to get from their employer in terms of their schedule. And so maybe we want to investigate that area. So again, using the symbology to really anchor our map on a particular policy. In this case, that 40 hours is the firm cutoff. And then finally, a housing example, where are households who spend more than 30% of their income on housing, which is a definition from HUD about what's considered burdensome housing costs, 30% of your income on housing. So again, we're not showing a map of median household income and then another map of home value and then another map of average rents, and hoping that people can put the story all together on their own. In this case, we are able to make one map, and oftentimes with policy mapping, less is more. So let's present one map. And let's think about where we are in the policy map's life cycle, or a policy life cycle, excuse me. So when an issue is brand new, it's often at the advocacy stage. People are raising awareness about this concern that they have. And then a little bit more, once it's gained a lot of traction, policy analysts can then compare different options, weigh, if we do it this way versus that way, what are some of our interventions and policy levers that we might have? And can we do more than one of those, et cetera? So a lot of weighing of options in that stage. Finally, you're maybe presenting it at a briefing with a mayor or a governor, that elected official, or more often their staffers. And you want to say, here's a recommendation that I have. Here's a proposal that I have that's going to solve a problem. and here's how you should implement a strategy. And then a data department in a lot of these state agencies have to report on different measures, and that leads the way to an outcomes map. And oftentimes a dashboard is a great version of this kind of outcomes map, mapping progress toward a goal. And then, as someone asked earlier, well, what about the consequences or the spillover effects? What did this policy actually do? Because not all policies work as intended. And so hopefully there is that formal evaluation post policy where policy researchers can review and analyze what effects it had. So for each one of these, a slightly different map is needed. So let's look at an advocacy map first. These ones often use symbology and pop-ups to their full potential to make a case. They show where a problem exists. Possibly there's limited access. Maybe, hospitals are here and the senior population is over here. Is there limited access? Is there no access? Maybe something is too close to something else. In Southern California, they have enacted ordinances about vape stores next to elementary schools. So you can think about one type of establishment being too close to another establishment. So that would be what we consider an advocacy map or an access map, showing, hey, here's how people are faring. Here's this population that doesn't live in the same proximity as this asset that they need to get to, whether that be a supermarket or things of that nature. So some examples here are this first one, again, using that above and below color ramp. This one shows kindergartners who enter their school districts with all required immunizations. And the goal of California Department of Health is 95% of kindergartners will enter schools with all their immunizations. So anything below 95 is in that bright pink color. I already talked about that middle one. And the third one here is this classic access map, where here's where the grocery stores are, here's where the people live. Green is you have access to 2 or more grocery stores. Light green, you have access to 1. And then blue is you've got to drive there. I do see a few things pouring into the chat, so I wonder if I should pause there and see any questions.
We have one question about the data itself, how using showing people over 65 as close to retirement age may not necessarily be retirement age. And so I think really the question might be, how do you adapt to data that changes with social change?
Yes, absolutely. So these are actually showing people who are 65 and still working.
Mm-hmm.
So totally correct that, yeah, people are working well into their 70s these days. So you can think of, yeah, changing that anchor. Maybe in the future, maybe it's not going to be 40 hours a week. Maybe it'll be 42 hours a week. Just making that up. But yeah, it'll be really easy to slide up and down that cutoff. And Jim will show you in the next segment about smart mapping and setting breaks and things like that. So yeah, that's a great question about, we want to make these maps really flexible and really dynamic. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, and we've got another one here. How do you deal with potential inaccuracies in data? Do you rely on data that has already been scrubbed?
That's a great question too. Yeah, I think all data has bias or error in it, especially American Community Survey data with the margins of error that they actually publish. And there are ways to incorporate that into mapping as well. But in terms of just inaccuracies, oftentimes that can come out in the symbology. You'll see, oh, hey, there's a big hole here, or, oh, hey, this just simply does not look right. And that can be a great first pass at eliminating or illuminating, I should say, illuminating some values that just do not pass the sniff test.
Yeah, for me, I'll just comment that in terms of dealing with potential inaccuracies, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So we find ourselves often are the first folks to see inaccuracies or see data issues. And that puts you on, it puts you on notice. It puts the people you're working for on notice of, okay, we noticed this thing. And then you'll see in some of our later examples how we try to mitigate the inaccuracy or error rates in things, because a lot of cartographic symbology, for example, has very hard edges. If you've ever made a thematic map of, I don't know, income or percent oak trees, a lot of mapping styles say, well, I'm going to use this color between 0% and 15%. And then from 16% to 30%, I'll use this other color. So we always ask ourselves, what magical thing happened exactly at 15%,
Right.
that you're now going to reassign a whole other color to that, knowing that the data's got some built-in, every data set's got some built-in error. Wouldn't you rather use symbology that's a little less sensitive to such hard edges? And so you'll see how we kind of incorporate that with unclassed symbology, unclassed colors, like what Diana's pointing to on the left, where 95% is at the middle of that color ramp. But if you're at 94.9% in this color ramp, it doesn't matter. In other mapping styles, it matters a lot. And so sometimes we compound our lack of understanding of error by then fixing it permanently with our choices in terms of cartography or other choices. So that's one topic. And honestly, our best recommendation is deal with it. Get aggressive with it to understand how real is this data. All data sets purport to represent some version of reality. And I think that's our job is as map makers and as analysts and as people who want to communicate with maps, is we have to own that. We have to own that error rate and be able to talk to it. Not all data sets are like the American Community Survey, where at least they hand you some margins of error data because it's a survey. And that is really helpful in that particular data set, but not all data sets can do that.
Yeah, but that's a great question. So after the advocacy maps have gained the traction needed for a policy issue to rise to the level of policy analysts weighing those options, some questions that we might want to challenge them to ask are, what have other similar areas done or tried in order to solve this type of issue? So it's almost like a lit review of previous policies. And what would that take? What would it take in our area or our community to replicate other success stories that we've seen? How can we implement the program the same way, or how similar is our community to that community? What can we expect to happen here? And did they actually achieve the desired outcome? Because like I say, not all policies actually work as intended. And finally, what kind of challenges did they face? What unforeseen issues came up? And so one kind of policy comparison map that you'll see all the time in the news is just like a map of states. And it says like, in these states, here's the policy, and in these other states, they don't have that. So here's where states can relocate polling places if there are natural disasters. So things like hurricanes or earthquakes. you're going to need to relocate polling places. I was surprised that all states didn't have a policy like this on the books. So just something to think about. But yeah, it makes it really clear. This is a state example, but you could obviously think about counties or cities or other jurisdictions. Like, here are the ones that have plastic bag bans or taxes. Here are the ones that have enacted plastic bag taxes for 2022, and here are ones that have not done anything. So it could be more than just a binary flavor like that. You could have multiple categories, but the type of map is really helpful here, where we're not mapping a continuous variable or a numeric variable even. It's more a categorical one generally.
A quick comment on that map you just showed. I had a similar, just quick anecdote during COVID. I was asked to help out with a national organization of government leaders who were looking at different policy aspects relating to COVID. You know, who has a mask mandate? So picture a layer or a map just like this, showing which states have enacted a mask mandate and which ones have done this with restaurants and which ones have done that with this. And there were, I think, maybe 11 different measures. And I did my thing. I was like, well, shouldn't we kind of, sum up what's going on in each state, almost like an index of response? And I actually mocked it up and showed it to them. And I knew this would probably happen. You couldn't see them back away from that map fast enough. They just did not want to compare themselves to other states. It was just like a lightning rod. And I knew that, but it also kind of points out, when we start comparing ourselves on one metric, we usually start comparing ourselves on additional metrics at some point in order to start to feel comfortable or to gain understanding about, well, why? And I think that's what I take away now from what Diana just said is, it was surprising to look at this particular map and see there's a couple of Gulf states that don't allow polls to move. That's kind of surprising. Or why don't all states provide it? And I think that's just kind of if I had approached it a little differently, it might have been to turn and say, why is each state approaching this topic of COVID differently? And I think that's what they did themselves. They kind of wanted to internalize that discussion and just express that within the state rather than be accountable across all states. Granted, now I understand that was about 9 months ago.
Yeah, really interesting and important topic.
Yeah, there's always a human element to, does the map ever see the light of day?
Yeah. Well, but in that case, your audience was, this person, this state decision maker. But yeah, so sometimes when you're doing this policy lit review, as I like to call it, then we get into, okay, what can we actually implement? What policy options do we really have? And of course, which option will benefit the most people? Could we potentially do more than one? And could one intervention have spillover effects in another area? So you can think about parks in one city can very easily be used by residents in a neighboring city. That would be a positive spillover effect. But then again, there's always negative spillover effects, such as the air quality type stuff or pollution, things like that. You got to think about the costs. That's the reality of the world we live in. And then who stands to gain, and does anyone stand to lose with each policy option? And some of the really great mapping products that I've seen that do a good job with this kind of policy options analysis are story maps that present different things that other places have tried. What can we do here? What innovative solutions are being tried by maybe the private sector? They tend to be a little bit more innovative sometimes. And then maybe the public sector can borrow from the private sector. And so some of these story maps just show this bill was passed in one state, and here was an option that possibly we can follow. And then the decision support map. This is like, think about you're going into a briefing with the city governor or the county commissioner or something like that, the city mayor rather, and we need to be able to say, hey, here's where the need is greatest, here's where access is non-existent or very poor, and these locations here, A, B, and C, would be good pilot locations for a test program, or here's where we have the most chance for being successful. Here's where we really believe we'll get the most bang for our buck. And these places might be just marginally below that goal. So back to that kindergartner vaccine example, getting a school district from that 94.9 to 95% is going to take a lot less intervention than a school that's at maybe 85%. And so, of course, the need is greatest at that second school district, but we have the most chance of being successful just with a very minimal amount of intervention. We can maybe do 2 of these school districts because this one is so close to the goal or the threshold. And so that air quality map that Jim showed, here's where the need is greatest in bright red, using symbology to its greatest potential. And then the solar example here too, again, I was surprised that we're not targeting the places where they've already adopted solar. It makes sense after you think about it, but the solar potential based on the sunlight may be greatest in these other places. But if places on the coast or places in Hawaii, like we saw with this analysis, are already using solar, we've got to focus on more inland areas. And then again, here, this state of Colorado one, using the legend to show here's where counties are most in need of programs. And then counties in orange definitely have room for improvement. And so it's just giving them that vision at a glance where there aren't even any numbers on this legend. It's a text-based legend, but it really does communicate, okay, here's where we've got to invest or intervene. Policy outcomes, again, this is like when the data comes into the data department and they publish it. Did we meet our goal? What results are we seeing, if any? And then how does our current status compare to before? If you're using public funds, then accountability is absolutely required. And oftentimes it's required with nonprofit funds, with grants or other funders like that. So a good way to show policy outcomes is this dashboard because of the real-time nature of what you can display in dashboards, or like a swipe style map before and after is a really cool way to show outcomes. And then that policy evaluation, once there's been enough time for any kind of secondary or tertiary effects to take place, maybe there's a formal evaluation of a policy. We can say, did it actually do what we intended it to do? And were there any unintended negative consequences from this? Possibly it worked for some places, but not in others. Or maybe it worked for some groups of people, but not for other groups of people. And then finally, what can we do about that? So it's a very iterative process. Here, what we saw with a policy evaluation was the RAND Corporation did a state-by-state study of different gun policies that different states had. And they love to do neighboring states. So we think that, people right on the border of one state versus another are pretty similar in nature. And so that way we can see almost what we call in social science a natural experiment, where this population's the same, but it's divided by this state line and policy there. So we can get at, did this have an effect or not? So that's one example. Another example from my line of work, formerly I worked in higher education, and there's a lot of states now that are doing free community college for 2 years. And you can think, okay, that's great. You know, we're seeing different populations going to college that never used to before. One unintended consequence of that was that military enlistment actually went down in a lot of those states. And then we have to ask, is that due to the policies themselves, or has military enrollment been going down this whole time? And so being able to do that state by state border analysis can help to answer those questions. So let me stop there and ask either Nick or Jim to look at the chat for questions.
Yeah, we have actually a question on training. And so when people are trying to do these kinds of things, when they're trying to create these maps that help maybe support decisions, but maybe they're not necessarily well versed, and they maybe need a little bit more education or guidance on how to set up layers for data mapping. How would they go about doing that?
Is this, you're referring to Regina's question?
Correct.
Yeah, I was thinking of, Regina, I was thinking about what you are saying there. Yeah, okay. And my reaction was, you were researching places for distance and access. So I've done similar maps of access. So I think in my mind, not knowing your full story here, but when I read what you wrote, in my mind, I immediately went to start by describing the current situation. Maybe in Diana's terms, it's an advocacy map. What is going on right now in terms of access? And then the thing you've got to overcome is, well, first of all, tell me why it matters. All right. And I trust you. It matters. Otherwise, you wouldn't bring it up. But the point is, the person or people who need to make a change, well, they need to see it. They need to see, what is the situation on the ground now? Why does it matter? Of course, that's an argument to make. You know, that's rhetoric. We need to make a case. And then the next step for me is, as Diana and I kind of noted earlier, do you have data? And so sometimes the answer is yes, I have this spreadsheet, or yes, I have this thing that's available. And the good news is, in my opinion, we're all living at a really opportune time in the history of mapping and GIS, because if you're able to open an Excel spreadsheet, you're able to get a map out of it in ArcGIS Online and put locations on the map. You can even define, here's a boundary within 10 minutes of that location, or 30 minutes of that location, whatever you consider fair access to be, by walking or by car, or by public transit, by bicycle, whatever, teleportation. I guess there's no distance involved in teleportation, is there? Anyway, so the point would be to describe, you get to set the playing field and describe what access looks like. Because again, as I said earlier, sometimes people assume that if you have a car, you can get anywhere you want. And therefore you shouldn't complain that you have to drive 2 hours to get access to this thing. And so that to me is all about starting with, here's the current situation. If you have a point in time, like maybe how it was configured 10 years ago when life was better, that's always good to show a comparison. That's a place we'll often take leaders. Here's how it was. Here's how it is, absent any change. And then let the story kind of carry from there. And then the third stage might be to propose locations. There's an organization called Trust for Public Land that has a program called ParkServe. If you Google ParkServe, all one word, you'll find that they'll describe the current access to parks in every US city. And they even have an application that says, well, if a city were to have budget to build an additional park, where would be the best location to do so? And I think that is so innovative. They not just only describe the current status and do a lot of rhetoric and explanation of why parks matter, but they also provide a solution that you can just browse and say, I want to go to Denver and look around, and you can actually see ranked #1 location for a new park, #2 location, based on some criteria. I think it's socioeconomic status of the people who live within, I think, a quarter mile or a half mile of a park entrance and things like that, or 10-minute walk. That's right, they use 10-minute walk. So that's maybe how you take inspiration from others' examples, is they not just point out the problem, but they also provide a proposed solution and in map form that can be, that can oftentimes, take down people's perceived or perception that, oh, this will be so hard to overcome. Oh, no, well, put a location here or open up an extra office over there.
Hi guys, Sabrina. I have kind of I guess a twofold question. In you all's experience, when you're receiving data from a client, or you have a client that's looking for this, that, and the third, do you all have a general idea of what type of graph you would use, just kind of based on the question that they're asking in you all's experience? And then the second question, Diana, I thought you brought up such an awesome point, where those states, oh goodness, I forgot the graph. Anyway, there's states that saw an increase, I guess, in student enrollment because of the free associate's degree, and then they saw a decline in military enlistment or commission, and we can't assume that they're associated. So
Right.
when the client when you present the original graph to answer the question to the client, do you also create another graph in looking into that kind of potential variable, if that makes sense?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there are ways to do that in terms of thinking like, well, these other states here didn't have the first year free for community college, and they also saw a military decrease.
Right. Okay.
Or perhaps, I mean, depending on what the case may be, maybe another state did have even better in tuition benefits, but yet they also saw increased military enlistment. So yeah, certainly. Or what has the overall trend in both college enrollment and military enlistment been in the past 5 to 10 years anyway? And did we see a sharp spike or a sharp decline right when this policy was enacted or not? So yeah, things like that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Just to comment on your first question, do we usually know or perceive of a certain map or graph? Yeah, I think, based on your previous experience, you just hear,
right.
When someone's talking, you can kind of hear what are they talking about. And maybe a previous map you've made or a previous chart you've made, or usually the combination of the two is very powerful. I think Diana is going to show some of that later. Some of that may spring to mind, but then I think we always try to then take a step back and just go check the fundamentals. Let's map the counts in the data, counts of oak trees. Let's map the rate of diseased oak trees. Okay. Let's map the count and the rate together to show almost like a map of grapes. Here are the ripe ones and here are the green ones. Here are the clusters of old diseased oak trees versus young undiseased, or maybe it's young diseased and old. You don't know until you map it. So we kind of have this philosophy of whatever map you're asked for, make that exact map for the person you're working with. Give them exactly what they asked for, because
you could go so many different directions as you map.
But also give them the best version of that map to do, and give them other views of things to just make sure that there's a little bit more holistic perception. I know on our team, when we get a new layer, we just did this last week with or 2 weeks ago with gross domestic product data by county. It's an exciting new data set that the Bureau of Economic Affairs puts out. And like we put 5 or 6 of us on a phone call, and in 1 hour, each of us had a deadline. You get 45, well, by the time we stopped talking at first, we all get 1 hour or 45 minutes to build a map off this GDP data. And we came up with 6 or 12 different perspectives all on one layer, and a pretty diverse set of maps. We find that's a great way to kind of engage people where they're at, because I'm an old GIS hand, I think a certain way, and someone who's newly hired, they may have a very fresh perspective that I'm just not open to. So we just try to broaden it out that way. So I think, yeah, it's a long-winded answer to say always give them, yeah, we usually have something in mind, but then we also are very diligent about let's seek some other perspectives, because you don't know what's in the data till you poke at it.
Awesome. That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, you'll notice that these things overlap because there is a lot of overlap. That it's a Venn diagram with lots of overlap, and it's a constantly cyclical process. So an outcomes map or an evaluation map can then become an advocacy map for the next stage of this whole issue that we're working with. Any other questions on this?
I see one from Fatima.
Yeah, and this is a question about if you can do comparative analysis. The example she gives is, comparing urban areas with more green space versus those with less green space, and maybe whether the air quality compared between those two places could be shown. And then additionally, would there be an option to add even more comparative layers on top of that? So very specific, I think.
Yeah, that one's a tough one. I'll comment first, and then Diana, you go. It's a tough one because of the nature of the problem. The green space is fixed. Excuse me. The green space is fixed in place, right? So picture Central Park in New York, or
right.
Picture a park near you, and it's fixed. It doesn't move. And over the surface of it blows the wind and the air. And so it kind of depends on, well, what is upwind of it typically? So if you happen to have a factory belching out smoke and it's upwind of this park, then these two are fighting each other in a sense, right? So it is possible to do. I would wonder about the scale of analysis for that. When the examples that we showed earlier were, I think, 50 kilometer hex or 50 kilometer hex bins. 50 kilometers is really big. You can fit many parks inside of it. But that's about the smallest size at which scientists are willing to estimate or model air quality. So unless you would shift to a spot analysis, go to the park, take measurements around the park, that might be an interesting type of study where it's park specific analysis of air quality. And you could do that by looking up some of those from the example I showed earlier, the air quality live app. Each of those stations is located somewhere. And I think some of them are located in parks. In my case, if I were to work with you on this, it would be, let's go do a literature review and let's find out if anybody has done work of this type in this space. I think it's just a question of measurement. There's relatively few air quality stations. There's more and more as people like Purple Air and others get devices out there in the community. I think in Los Angeles at one time, about 5 years ago, we had only 18 air quality measurement stations for all 20 million people living down here. It was kind of like sparse. Diana, your thoughts?
Yeah, I liked the idea of bringing in additional layers for analysis. I think that can be really key. So as you mentioned, parks are not super flexible in terms of their location, but maybe where can we plant a tree here or there that would have a good impact? Or I've seen little like pop-up play areas here and there at like farmers markets. And so it's on a street, but it does offer something that a park might offer. So things like that in terms of bringing in additional layers, absolutely.